Well, hey, everybody. It's good to see all of you. I'm Teresa Jenkins. I'm chair of the Public Programs Committee with your League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. Thanks so much for joining us as we strengthen our democracy because democracy needs defenders like you every single day. So the Public Programs Committee's goals we're, we have a few. Basically, what we do is we help you get a better sense of what's happening in your community, what's happening in your state, what's happening around the country, and also to empower you with facts. And we have a really informative program for you tonight. We'll give you lots of facts. But before we begin, we're going to hear from the president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. And then Dee Maitland is going to be serving as our moderator this evening. So she's going to introduce the program. She'll introduce our amazing speaker, and she'll tell you how you can ask questions of our speaker. So let me introduce to you right now the president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson, Betsy Boja. Hi, Betsy.
Hi, thank you, Teresa, and welcome everybody. I will be brief, but I just want to share that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization encouraging informed and active participation in government. We neither support nor oppose candidates or political parties at any level. At any level. Oh, somebody needs to mute. If everybody could mute themselves, that would be great. We neither support nor oppose candidates or political parties at any level of government. We do, however, advocate for public policies such as voting rights, non-discrimination, civil rights, reproductive rights, and criminal justice reform. We have been empowering voters and defending democracy in Greater Tucson for 84 years. And I am very excited for this program this evening. And I thank you all and welcome you all here.
Thank you, Betsy. Okay, Dee, take it away.
Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're here to meet Professor Paul Schuler with us. He's an associate professor and associate director of the University of Arizona School of Government and Public Policy. His research and teaching focus on democratic and authoritarian politics in Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam. He is also an expert on global democratic trends and indicators. At the University of Arizona, he designed a course, Dictatorship, Could It Happen Here?, which considers the possibility of autocracy emerging in the United States. He is not a U.S. politics expert, as he's been telling us, but is able to place the U.S. in a broader global context. That is what the talk today is about. He is willing to take questions during his talk. What I ask you to do is put them in the chat, and I'll be watching for your questions. And if they're appropriate to where he is in his talk, I'll interrupt him and ask your question then. Otherwise, I'm going to save it till the end of the presentation. So, Professor Schuler, welcome, and I turn the platform over to you.
Yep, great. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite. And as I mentioned, or as you mentioned in that wonderful introduction, I teach a class on dictatorship from a comparative perspective and talk about kind of what we can learn from global trends and how that translates into the prospects for authoritarian backsliding in the United States. And what you're going to get today is a little bit of a condensation of a whole semester's worth of a material, hopefully in a digestible format, but also with some pieces that have been cropping up in recent months. So there's a bit of an attempt to try to integrate what's been happening, which has been a lot in the last couple months. Okay, so with that in mind, obviously, probably not news to all of you, but there's been a lot of concern about the state of democracy in the United States. The scales here are a little bit probably more tilted towards the pessimists, I think, at this point than the optimists, probably amongst this particular audience. But there are still some who suggest that democracy in the United States may be resilient. So we'll talk about what some of the risks are, what some of the challenges are that you're all probably familiar with, and then some of the reasons to be concerned about the prospects moving forward in the US, but also some of the reasons why we might be cautiously optimistic about how resilient the United States might be. What I'm going to try to do at the beginning of this talk, however, is place what's happening in the United States in more of a global context. So I have here pictures of Narendra Modi in India, President Bukele in El Salvador, and of course, Vladimir Putin here on the right, as evidence of leaders across the world who have taken their country in less democratic directions, or at least have been perceived to have undermined democracy in their context. And I want to talk a little bit about how they've done it, what they've done, and what that means, and how that translates to the United States. But before getting into how democracy has been challenged or threatened in the United States and globally, I think it's useful just sort of set the baseline in terms of how comparative politics scholars, and most American politics scholars too, conceive of democracy. Because what I'm going to show you moving forward is some graphs and charts measuring democratic indicators, how democratic the United States is, how democratic Hungary, India, and other countries are. And they're going to be basically based on these four different components. They're sort of necessary but insufficient components for democracy. So the first condition for a country to be considered democratic, which is necessary but insufficient, is that there must be elections with more than one party that can compete. So this is, I think, what most people would understand of as being a democratic context, democratic country. There can't be single party elections and there can't be no elections. So this would rule out countries like China, rule out countries like Saudi Arabia that don't have elections. The second component is that there has to be participation open to everybody within reason over the age of 18. Now, this rules out some countries like South Africa under apartheid, where you did actually have multi-party competition, but only white South Africans were allowed to vote. And so by that criteria, it would not qualify as a democracy. In practice, as we're going to talk about today, pretty much all countries, authoritarian or democratic, meet these two first criteria, which is actually, a good thing. It shouldn't be taken for granted that this is the case. But around the world and most authoritarian regimes today, they do have multi-party elections, and at least everyone is legally allowed to vote. These third and fourth pillars that are under threat in most of the world today. The third is liberal freedoms. So in terms of having a free and fair election that's genuinely competitive, we need to have a certain amount of liberal freedoms. And those freedoms include things like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of protests. These are required in order for countries to have free and fair elections where people are able to criticize the government and can't be accused of libel, for example, for challenging what the government says. And then the fourth, which is also an important area where we're seeing concerns in the United States and globally, is executive constraints. We think of these in the United States as checks and balances or horizontal constraints. These are basically elite level constraints on the executive, if it's a presidential democracy, a president, or constraints on the prime minister from engaging in the politicization or abuse of authority to attack opponents and attack rivals. So these are sort of the four pieces of what we think of as a democracy. So the good news about what's happening around the world and the state of democracy around the world is elections, by and large, remain the only legitimate way to select a government. So around the world, even in countries that are sliding into autocracy, we have multi-party elections existing in pretty much every country. And so I'm going to put together some graphs that I've collected from different scholars. So these are not, most of them, not my own graphs, but I'm borrowing them from other research that's out there. So this is from a paper by Ann Mang and Andrew Little, which tries to make the case that things aren't as bleak as they look. And what they basically show here is that if we look since 1989 and 1990, and we look at the sort of observable indicators in terms of the competitiveness of elections, actually things don't look as bad as we might think they are. So this graph shows the percentage of time, or the proportion of time here, that the incumbent party loses an election that's held in a given country. What you can see here is that there was a big increase from 1990 up until the early 1990s, 1995, in the proportion of countries that were holding elections that would actually lose those elections. And the obvious reason for that big increase at the end of 1989, 1990 was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And really, since then, we've seen fairly stable levels of incumbents losing elections. Now, this incumbency not at stake basically means the incumbent party wins the election, even if the actual person that's running the country is not actually up for election. So in the case of the United States, it would be as if Barack Obama was not running for election, but the Democrat candidate won after Barack Obama would count as the incumbent party winning the election in that context. So what you can see here is that based on the observable measures, most countries are holding elections, and those elections at least appear to be viable for opposition candidates to win at reasonably stable levels. So we looked at some different measures here of competitiveness, kind of using raw numbers. These two graphs from the same article show the degree to which the legislature, the winning party in the legislature or the winning presidential candidate, the percentage of the vote that they're receiving. And so basically the idea here is the higher this number, the higher the winner vote share or seat share in the legislature, that should be an indication of a more uncompetitive or more authoritarian system. So if you have a system where Vladimir Putin is winning, say, 80 to 90% of the vote, then you would be seeing this number increase, and that would be an indication that you would have increasing levels of or decreasing levels of competition. And again, what you can see here is that since 1990, we've seen a decrease in the average vote share that the winners are receiving, and that's remained fairly stable at about 55% of the vote that they're receiving. And in terms of seat shares for the winning party in the legislature, it's held fairly steady at about 65 to 60% of the seat shares globally. Now, if we look at the average number of years that a ruling party remains in power, we can also see, if there's an increasing level of autocratization, we should see parties remaining in power for longer and longer periods of time. And we've seen not much of an increase there in terms of the parties remaining in power for longer periods of time. So just based on objective indicators, it appears that there is more competition, or at least stable levels of competition, since the 1990s. So what this sort of indicates is that elections remain basically the only legitimate way to select a government. So most countries, as we're going to talk about, at least pretend to use them and try to make them look competitive. And this shouldn't be sort of sniffed at. This shouldn't be dismissed as unimportant, because if you do have even rigged elections, it is still possible, or at least more possible, for the opposition to take over than would be the case in a single party system like China's, or a system of government where you don't have any elections at all, like Saudi Arabia. And so we have seen cases of countries that have undermined or threatened democracy. So Philippines would be an example of this, where under Rodrigo Duterte from 2016 to 2022, there was a massive extrajudicial anti-drug campaign where the regime killed more than 10,000 people, basically without due process. But at the end of 2022, there was an election, and an opponent won that election. Bongbong Marcos actually became the president. And so despite the fact that there were severe threats to democracy and the rule of law and the loss of life through physical integrity violations, we still nonetheless see a transition of power, which wouldn't be the case in a country like Saudi Arabia or China. We also see cases where elections that are heavily rigged or tilted against the opposition do actually transition to a democracy through the opponents managing to overcome those odds and win an election, despite the fact that there are odds stacked against them. So Malaysia in 2018 would be an example of one of these countries. Malaysia has a heavily gerrymandered system, similar to the way that Hungary, which we'll talk about a little bit later, gerrymanders its system. Yet nonetheless, the opposition was able to band together to ultimately overthrow that government after a massive corruption scandal involving its prime minister. So what this basically suggests is that if we look at this graph, which I'm not going to ask you, I'm not going to test you on this graph here, but I'm going to explain to you very, very briefly what I'm showing here. It's actually fairly simple here. So in rigged systems, essentially what we have is a system where, unlike this dark black line, where we expect the observed incumbent vote share to match what they would get absent manipulation. So if there's no manipulation in an election and there's 50% support for the opponent, that means we'll observe 50% of people voting for the opponent, right? So there should be a 1-to-1 ratio between what you observe in a non-manipulated election and what the actual underlying level of support was. What you see in these manipulated elections is that there's a shift towards the left, where the actual incumbent vote share absent manipulation might be 20%, but because of manipulation, if there's a medium level of manipulation, it might be 45 to 50%. And if there's a lot of manipulation, it might be 70 to 75% that we're actually observing. So this gives you a sense of what manipulating the elections does. It does still make it possible for opponents to win. It just means that they have to overcome greater odds in which to do it, right? So you need to drive down incumbent support to less than 20 to 30% for opponents to be able to win in some of these systems. So this is a long way of saying democracy is under threat. This is certainly not a great situation, but even in these rigged elections, it is possible that opponents can win, and it does happen from time to time. Poland is another case where this happened last year. Poland's elections were heavily tilted against the opposition, but the opposition did manage to overcome those odds. I'm not checking the chats, but if I saw there was a chat, and if there is a question, I can't quite see it in my what type of an election manipulation is typically used? So I'm going to get into that a little bit. I'm going to get into sort of what the different strategies that are being used, not just to manipulate the elections, but actually to manipulate the political environment prior to the election. So I want to think about election manipulation fairly broadly. In fact, what we tend to see the least amount of is electoral manipulation after the election, where people are manipulating the counting of the votes or ballot box stuffing. We actually see, where possible, autocrats try to rig the game prior to the election because it makes it much less likely that there'll be protests against those elections if they can do it in that way. So we'll talk a little bit about specifically what they're doing. Okay, so the bad news. Okay, so that's the good news. There are elections. They might be rigged, but they're happening, and that does give a sliver of hope for the opposition. The bad news, of course, is that there's been what we call democratic backsliding, or at least we perceive there to be democratic backsliding around the world, and which this is basically the retention of elections with constraints on the competitiveness of those elections. And this is happening in two broad sets of ways. There's two broad sets of strategies democratic backsliders are using in order to undermine the competitiveness of elections. One is constraints on liberal freedoms. So basically the ability of people in society, ordinary citizens or opposition candidates, to engage in free speech, to be able to criticize the regime, or in some cases, the ability to avoid arbitrary arrest and unlawful detention. So in terms of constraints on media freedom, this is something that's obviously been in the news very, very recently in the United States, of course, with what's been going on with Jimmy Kimmel and the lawsuit against the New York Times. And we'll talk a little bit about ABC News or 60 Minutes and the lawsuit against 60 Minutes. This is one of the first things that the democratic backsliding countries do, because it's one of the easiest things for them to do, quote unquote, legally. And so we've seen constraints on the media freedom in Venezuela, Turkey, Russia, and Hungary. And I'll talk specifically about Russia and Hungary in a few slides, what happened in those countries. Attacks on members of the opposition. So in Hungary and Venezuela, there have been attacks and threats on members of the opposition. Detentions without due process. So unlawful detentions. The Philippines and El Salvador. Philippines was very notorious for this. This was essentially the drug war, where without any actual trials or arrests, they were murdering people accused or suspected of engaging in using drugs or trafficking drugs in that country. And El Salvador has engaged in an anti-crime campaign as well under Bukele, where they're essentially relying on arbitrary arrests without due process. So these are constraints on liberal freedoms, and we'll talk specifically in a couple cases to give you a bit more concrete insight into how it's actually operating on the ground in a couple countries in a second. The second class of constraints on the competitiveness of elections are horizontal constraints, the undermining of horizontal constraints. So for a country to be democratic and to avoid using the bureaucracy to challenge political opponents, typically we expect that authoritarian or democratic regimes will have checks and balances or some degree of horizontal constraints. So constitutional revisions have been used to try to undermine the power of Congress, for example, or legislatures to control presidents or prime ministers. Venezuela and Hungary, almost immediately after Chavez came into power, immediately after Viktor Orban came into power in 2020 or 2010, they rewrote the constitution to give more power to the executive and to undermine the influence of the legislature. They also undermined the influence of the judiciary by rewriting the rules in terms of how the judges were selected and how they were appointed. And so that's another feature of democratic backsliding countries. The undermining of the judiciaries is probably one of the areas where I have the most hope for the United States, because the United States probably has the strongest tradition of judicial independence and probably the strongest public understanding of what the judiciary is, its constitutional review process, which differs from some of these other countries that we'll talk about, where it was much easier for them to strip away the independence of the judiciaries. And then unfair electoral reforms is another piece that's used by would-be autocracies. Basically engaged in extreme forms of gerrymandering, changing the electoral laws in ways that advantage the incumbent and disadvantage the opponents. Just looking. Okay, so I'm just looking at these questions here, and I'll try to get to a few of them as I go through. We'll talk a little bit about Russia in a second. So if we look at one of these more qualitative measures of democracy around the world, this is the varieties of democracy indicators, and how the varieties of democracy indicators are constructed is there's a whole list of criteria that go into a country being democratic. Varieties of democracy asks professors or experts on those countries to provide grades or scores for those countries going back all the way to 1900. And essentially what they do is they use an item response model to basically come up with a median score for each country in terms of where it stands on a bunch of these different qualitative indicators, including democracy. They also ask about corruption and different things. I can talk to you a little bit offline if you, or at the end, if you want to know kind of how this is constructed and whether or not this is reliable or not. But this is the measure. This is probably the best measure that we have to try to measure very short-term shifts in the quality of democracy over time. So unlike the measures I showed you before, which are based on objective indicators that we can measure objectively with raw data, this is based more on subjective indicators. Because things like threats to the media, things like threats to due process are much harder to measure in practice. How do we know that the United States media is less free today than it was before? We might sense it based on things that are happening, but it's hard to come up with a very objective measure of that. And so this is what the varieties of democracy measure is supposed to try to do. So what you can see here is that there's two lines, and it's important to understand the distinction between these two lines, because depending on which one of these lines you're looking at, you might have a more rosy or less rosy view of democracy. So what you can see here is that there's an increase in the degree to which countries are deemed democratic, again, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. This not only affected Eastern Europe as well as the Soviet Union, but it also affected sub-Saharan Africa, where the Soviet Union was propping up a lot of different single-party regimes in that part of the world. So we see an increase in the degree of liberal freedoms and elections in those countries. What happens is right around 2014 or 2015, we start to see a dip. This dip is more pronounced when we use the population-weighted measures rather than the independent countries measures. What that basically means is this blue line treats every country, the Bahamas, the same as China, the same as India, and they all count as one country in the global average. For certain reasons, we might think that's a better measure, but we might also think we might care about how much of humanity is living under more or less democratic conditions. And so when we look at the population weighted average, which of course is going to give a country like India much more weight, because India accounts for an eighth or a seventh of the world's population. If we see a dip in India's score, that's going to affect this red line much more than it affects this blue line. And so that's in fact what we see here is right around the election of Modi, but also the election of Donald Trump, mid-2015s, 2016s, we start to see a more pronounced decline when we use these population weighted averages. Now, I think there is reason to pay attention to both of these numbers. I think the reason why the red line matters is what more than perhaps the blue line is not so much just that the population, we should care about the number of people in those countries, but that the countries that are represented by this red line more heavily, the United States and India, are countries that have much more impact globally in terms of diffusing the support for democratic norms. And so we'll talk a little bit about that at the end when we talk about the United States and how that fits into this picture. So I want to go into a couple specific countries that are driving that kind of broader trend. So one of the countries that we're looking at there that really drives those numbers is China. But as you can see, China is not really responsible for the decline because China has been unambiguously authoritarian since independence in 1950, or since the end of the Civil War, excuse me, in 1949, 1950. So China is not really driving the numbers much. They've had no elections, and so they haven't really had any shift. Where we can see a big shift is in India, which is in 2014, 2015 with the election of Narendra Modi. We can see a decline in the liberal democracy scores there. Hungary, which gets a lot of attention because of Viktor Orban, after his election in 2010, we see a pretty dramatic decline immediately after his election. The United States, we see a decline in the scores here with Donald Trump in 2016. There's a slight mild rebound under Joe Biden. This graph only goes to 2024. I'll show you some other graphs that have more up-to-date figures that rely on public opinion data to kind of show a very dramatic drop after 2020, basically January 2024 or 2025 with Trump's inauguration. So in terms of the components of democracy, elections continue to be held with participation, but liberal freedoms and executive constraints are eroding that undermine the competitiveness of elections. So why is that occurring? So I think one thing to understand about the stability of democracy is to understand how democracy is protected in the first place and what the role of institutions are in defending democracy. So probably all of you are familiar with the Madisonian dilemma, Federalist 51. If men were angels, this is the argument for if men were angels, we wouldn't need a government. But basically, the Madisonian dilemma is in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, you must oblige it to control itself. So the answer to this problem in the US Constitution and implicitly in these varieties of democracy measures is the way that you solve this is make ambition counteract ambition. And so you have horizontal constraints that prevent any one side, particularly the chief executive, who is usually the person that we're most concerned with, preventing them from engaging in what we call executive aggrandizement, basically asserting more and more authority for themselves against the other branches that are meant to check them. And so I think there's this notion to some degree that this is a self-enforcing equilibrium. In the context of the United States, if we have the judiciary and the Congress as independent, this should prevent anyone from emerging as an autocrat from the presidential office. The problem here is that horizontal constraints are often not self-enforcing. So many of you may know who this person is. This is Learned Hand, the famous U.S. justice who never made it to the Supreme Court. But he had a speech during World War II in 1944 where he was basically commemorating several thousand new immigrants into the United States, basically a naturalization ceremony. And he basically said that liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, there's no constitution, no law, no court that can even do much to help it. And basically, the argument here is formalized in a more academic setting, which is that if you have one side of society, one party that acquiesces to transgressions of authority by the chief executive, that ultimately is going to be enough to undermine the democratic system, right? So this is sort of a formal model here. I'm not going to go through the details of it, but basically the model here suggests that the sovereign here, which is the chief executive in most countries, can decide to not transgress on the democratic freedoms of either party, if we assume there's a two-party system, but we could abstract this out to a multi-party system. They could decide to transgress against both, or they could transgress against only one party. So we could have a Democrat in power that only decides to prevent Republicans from being able to vote or vice versa. For there to be an effective response to this, you essentially need to have both sides, or at least some groups on both sides, preventing or challenging this seizure of power. So the most famous example from the United States is thinking about the FDR attempt to pack the courts. FDR attempts to pack the courts. He's got a large majority in the legislature. I have Barb Narander here in the audience, so I'm very nervous about wading too much into this in case I get something wrong. But essentially, you have a faction of the Democrats being willing to join the opposition to check that packing of the courts, which would have been completely legal, right? Because he can change the number of justices there are in the Supreme Court. You can change that through an act of Congress. So it wouldn't be an illegal action, but it's one that's seen as potentially undermining the spirit of the Constitution and the spirit of checks and balances. Which brings me to why constitutions can't save us. The reason why constitutions can't save us is because they're what we call incomplete contracts. Maybe some of you are familiar with this idea of an incomplete contract, but the basic idea of incomplete contracts is we could think of a constitution as a contract between the governed and the governed, the governors and the governed. Unfortunately, constitutions, just like the contracts we sign for a new car, or contracts we sign to have a new job, they can't cover or predict every eventuality that might happen. Things are going to come up that aren't necessarily written down explicitly in those contracts. So they must be interpreted. Unfortunately, people who have ulterior motives that want to undermine democracy can interpret those things in ways that follow the letter of the law, but undermine the spirit of the law. So we could think of something like pardon power, which is a power that the president has in the Constitution. It may not have been foreseen that a president could potentially use the pardon power to acquit people who commit crimes on their behalf to ultimately undermine the freeness and fairness of elections, for example. This is an example maybe of an unintended consequence of a poorly written constitution, or it could simply be a result of an incomplete contract. At the time, no one perceived that this would be possible, but 100 years later, people decide to adapt it in this new way. And so ultimately, executive aggrandizement can only be stopped in this sense in any constitution if one side basically agrees to cooperate with the other side to say, yes, this might be legal, but we think this moves beyond the bounds of what was intended by the Constitution and what is required by the Constitution. So we can think of a lot, basically, this is support for the norms that underpin the Constitution. So the independence of the Department of Justice would be an example of a norm that you're supposed to have, because obviously if you politicize the Department of Justice, you can use that to attack political enemies. That's not written in the Constitution anywhere that it has to be independent of the president and the president shouldn't be involved. But previous presidents have been very keen to try to emphasize the independence they have from directing the FBI or directing the Department of Justice because of this unwritten norm that it's essentially required for the Constitution to work as it's intended to function. And if it doesn't do that, then essentially the means with which you have the parties being able to prevent this from happening are in the Constitution. They are, impeachment, or they are the removal of people from the cabinet positions by members of the parties. So I don't want to suggest that constitutions are unimportant. They still matter. And they matter in this sense. They matter as in they are a coordination device for people who would oppose these actions. They provide the procedures and the roadmap for those parties to be able to engage in checks on presidents that are trying to aggrandize their authority. And so in the US Constitution, this would be the impeachment procedures, or this would be procedures through which legislators or the Supreme Court can declare provisions or actions by the president non-constitutional. Dee, I see that you've unmuted yourself. I don't know if you have a question.
No, I thought you'd, I had talked before and I realized I'd muted, so you didn't know I did.
Okay. So this brings us to today's autocracies and what's been happening around the world. So I put these two figures here who you're all very familiar with, Vladimir Putin on one side and Joseph Stalin on the other, to suggest that today's autocracies are not like the autocracies of the totalitarian era of the 1930s. So we could also put Adolf Hitler here. We could put Benito Mussolini as examples of leaders who ruled in authoritarian fashions, but in very different ways, where they essentially dismantled elections entirely and dismantled opposition parties entirely. Vladimir Putin as we'll talk about, Viktor Orban, Narendra Modi, they're operating from a different playbook. And that playbook is essentially this: taking advantage of the inability for the ruling party and the opposition parties to coordinate against anti-democratic actions. What today's autocrats do is rely on what we might call a boil the frog, salami slicing, sort of slow diminution of the quality of elections over time, such that the ruling party's supporters don't oppose or join the opposition to reject some of the actions that's being taken by the leader. So there's two different terms that are used to describe this sort of set of strategies. One is authoritarian legalism, where basically you use the law to legally aggrandize the executive or give it more authority vis-a-vis some of the other institutions in the country. Some other authors call this bending, where you basically undermine liberal freedoms by following the letter of the law or not the spirit of the law. And the goal of these strategies is to chip away at democratic constraints in ways that do not generate a collective response. Going again back to my previous model of how you defend democracy, they're basically ways of trying to undermine the freeness of elections. They're undermining the ability of opposition parties to coordinate without generating a collective response. So it's basically like your child asking for more and more small things to get away with ultimately big things over the course of time. And so some examples of this are legally enacting judicial reforms, pressuring the bureaucracy to investigate political rivals, or legally changing the electoral system to advantage the incumbent party. So I want to go through kind of how this worked in Russia, which was sort of the forefather of this kind of strategy, and then talk about some more recent cases. So in terms of Vladimir Putin, how he was appointed in a fairly democratic fashion. Boris Yeltsin resigned because he was very unpopular and there were massive protests against him. Vladimir Putin happened to be his vice president. In 1999, he was appointed. In 2002, he won a reasonably free and fair election by Russia standards and was elected into office. When he was elected, there were anti-Putin media outlets, ORT and NTV, which we could analogize to the Washington Post being controlled by Jeff Bezos and AT&T and CNN and various other media outlets in the United States that are controlled by oligarchs. The owners of these media outlets were oligarchs at the time who were not particularly popular in society because they had gotten rich largely because of taking advantage of the collapse of the Soviet Union to get rents that many people thought they should not have gotten. So although they are free and fair media, they are important for democratic freedoms, the owners of them are not particularly popular. And that sort of translates to what we might see in the United States, where people respect the freedom of the media, but they don't necessarily like the owners of those media outlets. So in this particular context, Putin was able to take control of the bureaucracy and use it to basically threaten the owners of these outlets into selling their media outlets to Putin-friendly operatives. So in the case of ORT, Berezovsky, who's the owner, was arrested and forced to sell his shares to Roman Abramovich, who some of you might know owned Chelsea Football Club, as a sort of Putin-friendly oligarch in Russia, and basically forced him to sell him to them in order to have his friend released from jail. In the case of NTV, one of the oligarchs in charge of that organization, Guzinski, was arrested on tax charges and allowed free if he sold NTV to Gazprom, which is a Kremlin-linked oil company. The result is that elections have persisted in Russia, but the media has been completely controlled by Vladimir Putin. So this is kind of an example of some of the early tactics that he took in that country. India has been following some of the same strategies. In India since 2014. We've seen executive constraints being undermined, courts' independence being threatened, aligning with the government on key cases. In terms of civil liberties, the media has been undermined also in India, and the Muslim minorities have been persecuted and prevented from being able to vote. So there's been a lot of attacks using the BJP nationalist support to try to go after Muslim minority groups, which in India is a minority group. It's only about 10 to 20% of the population, but still amounts, because of India's massive size, to about 100 million people. So there's still a massive Muslim population in India. And they've also used various security measures. So we have the Alien Enemies Act in the United States, which would be something sort of like this. The Unlawful Activities Prevention Act of 2019, which could designate an individual as a terrorist and allow the government to arrest them without a trial. So that sounds familiar to things that might be happening in other parts of the world as well. So this is a common tactic of basically redefining who an enemy of the state is, giving the government the security umbrella with which to go after people that they deem to be enemies of the state, pitch it in security terms, and then allow them to essentially threaten or arrest them or deport them in the cases of India as well, without due process. But through this process, elections have remained relatively untouched. And in fact, Narendra Modi in the most recent election in 2024 lost seats relative to previous elections. So that's both the negative side and the positive side of what's been happening in a country like India. Hungary is kind of the most prominent case, and I think I'll sort of finish on Hungary and then talk a little bit about kind of what this means from the United States so we have a chance for Q&A. In Hungary, in 1991, when they became a democratic country, they enacted a constitution that limited the size of small parties. They wanted to try to create larger parties with the idea that this was going to make a more stable democracy. What ended up happening as a result of that is that in 2010, after the financial crisis, Orbán's party won 51% of the vote, but got 67% of the seats in the parliamentary legislature there. So they have a parliamentary government rather than a presidential system. 67% is important because that gives them a supermajority. And a supermajority essentially allows them to amend the Constitution without having to compromise with the opposition party. As we'll talk about in the next slide, they have used this supermajority to rewrite the Constitution almost immediately in ways that have entrenched their power, and they've won supermajorities in each subsequent election from 2014, 2018 to 2022. So why do we think of them as authoritarian? Clearly, VDEM thinks of them as authoritarian, as we see in the graph here. There's been a massive decline in the democracy scores. So what's happened there as a result of this supermajority that they gained in 2020? So that one of the first things they did was judicial reforms, both through legislation and through the Constitution. They created a national judicial office, which allowed them to select and demote judges and move cases to friendly jurisdictions. So if there was a political case that the government really cared about, they could move it away from a judge they didn't like and move it towards a judge they did like. They also lowered the judicial retirement age from 70 to 62, which allowed an opening up of a bunch of different slots, including on the Constitutional Court, which essentially allowed them to pack the courts. So this is something that a lot of autocracies or democratic backsliding countries do, is they change the retirement age to force out a lot of judges to then allow them to pack the courts with their own members. Electoral reform. So electoral reform, one of the things that they did is that they engaged in a very specific form of gerrymandering, which we call malapportionment. We have malapportionment in the United States. It's called the US Senate. Basically, malapportionment is a situation where there's a different amount of representatives for a certain population. So we have malapportionment in the United States because we have 2 senators for California and 2 senators for Wyoming. That means that senators are representing different numbers of people. Now, in the United States, we don't think of that as non-democratic because that was initially designed not specifically to benefit a specific political party. What's happened in Hungary is that they've rigged this system in a way to actually benefit their own party. And what they've done is they essentially take areas where they're popular, divide them up into smaller districts so they get more representatives per voter in their areas, and then they pack all of the opponent's supporters into big districts that are represented only by 1 or 2 representatives. And in that way, they can expand the representation for their supporters and decrease it for the opposition. I won't go through all the different details of things they've done, but this is the type of thing that they've done. And again, it's all legal because they controlled the supermajority. None of this was necessarily illegal. They changed the courts. The courts approved these electoral reforms. And we have a situation where the opposition has a harder time of winning. All right, because I've gone on for a little while here, and I want to make sure that we get to the United States, I'm going to skip ahead to the United States here and talk about how the US fits into these trends or does not fit into these trends. This is a graph from Brightline Watch, which some of you may have heard of. I'm not sure if you have or not. It's by some professors out of Dartmouth and Georgetown University, I think. Definitely Dartmouth. But they basically conduct surveys for political science professors since 2016, basically examining how democratic they think that the United States is on a bunch of different measures. And what you can see here is that there's been a massive decline since January of 2025, basically on a bunch of these different measures. Free speech, Agencies do not punish political opponents, no interference with the press, investigations are not compromised by political considerations, judicial independence, government statistics are not influenced, obviously with the Bureau of Labor Statistics firing. These are some of the reasons for the declines in those numbers. So what you can see here is that there's been a massive shift, even from 2016. So experts actually prior to 2025 were more positive on democracy in the United States than the public was. Experts actually thought democracy had survived some of the attacks by the first Trump administration and was actually reasonably confident that democracy would persist. But what you can see here is that since 2020, 2025, we're in a different era. Experts think that we've moved into some different world. And it's based on a lot of the actions that have been taken in the first 6 months of the administration. So we can talk specifically about what those are in the Q&A if you would like, but I'm sure that many of you, by reading the newspaper, probably have a good idea of what those actions were that might trigger these changes. So I want to focus on what we can learn from global trends and what this means for the United States. So I think first, specifically with regard to what we expect to see in the future, we see some concerns about whether or not elections are going to happen in the future. Based on what we see in the rest of the world, elections are likely to occur in the United States. It's worth remembering that the United States had an election in 1864 at the end of the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln was actually very unpopular, and it wasn't certain that the North was going to win. Abraham Lincoln still held an election, which he ultimately ended up winning for reasons we could talk about. But around the world, autocrats are not canceling elections. And I think importantly, they're not rigging the outcomes of those elections. So if we look at a case like Hungary, there's few disputes that the election counts are being manipulated or being stuffed. But the game is being rigged beforehand because there's no opposition media and because of the electoral manipulation in terms of the gerrymandering of the districts and the changes that Orban is conducting in terms of how he conducts those elections. So ex post fraud is rare. It does occur, but there are reasons why it doesn't occur. When it tends to occur, that can lead to, again, we talked about this boiling the frog strategy that autocrats like to use. They don't want to do things that are sudden and blatant and could get people very mad at one period of time. The problem with fraud after an election is that people, when they see that fraud after the election, first of all, they know the regime is unpopular because otherwise they wouldn't have had to rig the election. And secondly, they're all pissed off at the same time. So it means that they have something to be very angry about, and they have a moment in time that they can kind of coordinate their protests. Mexico in 1988, Kyrgyzstan and the colored revolutions in the Central Asian republics are examples of rigging the election post hoc that backfired on regimes that tried to do that. So it is likely that the elections will occur, and it's unlikely in the United States that the elections won't be counted. And I also think it's unlikely that a January 6th would succeed in the United States for reasons that we've seen in the rest of the world. The US also has some specific advantages. It has term limits, which are an advantage over countries like Hungary and Poland. Parliamentary systems don't have term limits. Term limits are also very difficult to change because they provide, again, a focal point where people understand term limits and they will oppose those changing of the term limits if they think governments are trying to do them. So we see in a number of African countries, leaders that have tried to undermine term limits have been protested against and thrown out of office for doing that. So the US has an advantage there. It also has a decentralized electoral system, which does provide some bulwark against a federalized manipulation of the electoral system. So what Viktor Orban did in Hungary is very difficult to do in the United States. And we have a stronger history of independent courts. Court packing was easier for Hugo Chavez to do in Venezuela, to occur in Poland, to occur in Hungary, because they have a much shorter tradition of independent courts. The United States has a much longer tradition, and we've seen attempts at court packing in the past, including sort of suggested by Joe Biden, quickly been rebuffed. Right, so court packing is not a thing that seems to have a degree of support in the United States. So that does some advantages for the United States. Some disadvantages are extreme polarization. We didn't have time to get into it in this presentation, but polarization does increase the propensity with which you can have democratic backsliding. For reasons, again, that we talked about, the coordination between Party A and Party B. If you have polarization, it's harder for those two sides to coordinate to prevent the executive aggrandizements. We also have a heavily armed population. That is bad for civil conflict. I won't go into I think the theories behind that, but it's pretty self-explanatory why having a heavily armed population is not great for democracy. And gridlock after midterms. So this is the final thing I'll leave you with, which is somewhat pessimistic. One of the potential things we could look forward to in the United States, the election is going to occur. We could have a midterm election where the Democrats win at least the House of Representatives. Perhaps they engage in an impeachment exercise. The concern that we have in the United States is that we could see a situation that happened in South Korea earlier this year, where the president was also unpopular, also challenged by the Congress, and then decided to declare martial law to basically suspend Congress. And so if we do see divided government in this particular context, that could be a potentially dangerous situation for a couple of years. And so, sorry, I went a little bit over time here. I had a lot to talk about, but I think I'll leave the remaining moments here in this torrential storm that's going on outside for some Q&A.
Wow. We want more, but there you go. Let's get the more through the questions. What kind of election manipulation is typically used? And I think you've already answered that one. And that another question about Putin putting an end to a puppet show, maybe sort of like Jimmy Kimmel, because he felt it criticized him. You think there's a direct line?
Oh, with regard to, yeah, I mean, I think the media is certainly one of the first targets, because media outlets tend to be unpopular and the owners of the media outlets tend to be unpopular. And so the way that Jimmy Kimmel is being, the suggestion in terms of how he's being moved out is not necessarily the government saying to ABC, you've got to fire Jimmy Kimmel. They're putting pressure on the subsidiary companies who want to, engage in mergers or not have their finances threatened. And this is sort of a similar strategy that we saw under Vladimir Putin, and we've seen in other contexts. And it works because who wants to be on the side of defending the owners of many of these companies, right? We may agree that the media outlets are, important for a free and fair media, but we don't necessarily, the people that run them are not necessarily sympathetic people, because they're usually very wealthy, and the public tends not to support very wealthy people.
Now, you only mentioned oligarchs like once or twice, but we're starting to see a major consolidation of media in the hands of just a few, due to the overthrow of Glass-Steagall and other laws against monopolization. Did anybody track, can you tell I'm an economist? Did anybody track monopoly laws as being a danger to democracy? Or just the rich-poor divide that has become really serious since the 1980s here?
Yeah, so there have been a lot of studies examining the relationship between income inequality and democracy, and most of the studies suggest that income inequality is detrimental for democracy, in part because it makes the wealthy want to cling to power and use influence over the government in order to prevent the median voter from having an influence over policy. The more the income inequality is, the more the difference between the interest of the wealthy and the interest of the poor kind of differ. And so one set of arguments suggests that income inequality makes the wealthier less inclined to want democracy, as sort of one of the arguments. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Poland as some success in being able to overcome the dictatorial tendencies of the people in power. Are there some other successes you can give us?
Well, so Poland, I think, is an interesting case, because Poland points to a less thorough autocratization than occurred in a context like Hungary. So Poland, the majority never won a supermajority of control, and so it was not able to completely rewrite the constitution. So it engaged in some activities that allowed it to undermine the independence of the judiciary, but it wasn't able to, essentially Viktor Orban can rewrite the election law before every single election. And so if the opposition doesn't know the game it's playing before the election, it's very, very difficult for it to coordinate its strategy. I don't really have enough time to kind of get into the details of some of the specific things that it did in some of the more recent elections, but Poland's leadership didn't have quite that same level of control. And so that was kind of one key difference. I would say India is maybe a quasi success story in the sense that the BJP did lose seats despite all the things that it's been doing. So it hasn't lost control, but it did lose seats. And in the context of Malaysia, we've seen we saw the loss of the ruling party there, UMNO, who had been in power for about 30 to 40 years, ultimately lost in 2018, despite some of the same gerrymandering or malapportionment tactics that Hungary was using. They overcame pretty formidable odds. It took a $2 billion corruption scandal to do it. But that's another feature of authoritarian regimes, is that they tend to have a lot of corruption involved in them. So it does give some ammunition for opposition, which does raise one point that I think I had a slide on this, but didn't have time to go over this, but how do you kind of overcome these transgressions? What are some strategies that are successful? In general, you need to have a big tent coalition that combines people who support democracy with people who may not necessarily care about democracy first and foremost, but connect the issue they do care about to the broader narrative of authoritarianism. So in the context of Malaysia, people were very upset because the prime minister there basically siphoned off $2 billion from the government's retirement fund and funneled it into his own bank account through a foreign laundered company. And again, there's a New York Times article about some things that have been happening in the United States with regard to transfers from people to people. Corruption is very unpopular, obviously, and particularly in a context where you have high levels of inequality. This can be a very strong galvanizing force for people to think that someone is profiting. Even if I don't care about democracy, I might still see this as a result of a lack of accountability, and that might help you build a bigger coalition if you can kind of weld these different issues together. So I think that's one lesson we've learned from a couple different countries.
The UAE transactions of the last couple of weeks. What about the deployment of military to cities to create fear?
Yeah, I mean, so it remains to be seen kind of what I think in terms of democracy, the most worrying version of this was the deployment of the troops to the Gavin Newsom rally. That was not troops. I think those were ICE agents that were showing up at the Gavin Newsom rally. Now everything is worrying, in the sense that anything that's extrajudicial or not following the rule of law or relying on, suspensions of habeas corpus, always concerning. The Philippines is kind of an example of a case where that occurred on a massive scale with a massive loss of life, but it weirdly didn't really undermine competition for elections because it wasn't necessarily done in a particularly targeted manner at political opponents. It was done at drug users and drug dealers. And again, this sounds like splitting hairs and being an academic. 10,000 people were murdered as a result of this policy. So it's obviously horrible. But in terms of the impact it'll have on tilting the elections, sending these enforcers to political rallies to intimidate people from showing up at them or showing up at polling places is kind of where we should be directly paying attention to for the election, right? So you can imagine if they're going after cities, that's where Democrats happen to vote. And if there's any attempt to kind of intimidate people from showing up at those polling places because they thought they might be detained accidentally for being,
Illegal.
a migrant, that could potentially undermine voter turnout in areas that are heavily democratic. So those are, I think, some of the things to watch out with regard to democracy.
Well, and now probably the most important question we have for you. If we get the chance, should certain norms that have been ignored or shattered be codified into law? And what are the most important norms we need to reclaim?
Wow, that's an A+ question. So I don't know if we're specifically talking about. I'm going to take an easier case of gerrymandering because I have an easier answer to this one. If we're thinking about the referendum in California, so I think in this case, like gerrymandering, at the subnational level, I don't view as necessarily anti-democratic. And I think in the context of the United States, it's been happening. It happens in Illinois, it happens in Maryland, it happens in now Texas. So I don't particularly view what Texas did the manner in which it did it, if it did it illegally, this is where I'm outside of my sort of realm of knowledge here, but if it happened illegally, then that would be one thing. If it's within their legal power to do that, I think that's something that would be in kind of a gray area. I think the bigger issue is what about having a coup, for example, to prevent something that's illegally happening on the part of the president, right? We've seen cases of this in Central America where there were legitimate concerns, and we see this in Thailand as well, where there were concerns that an elected leader was engaging in authoritarian actions, and the military then decided to remove that person in the name of democracy. That is a much riskier proposition, because once you have your first coup, it's very hard to get out of that cycle. The biggest predictor of having a coup is having had a coup in the past. And so those types of, depending on the type of non-democratic response to non-democratic actions, I would classify those as potentially dangerous. And there's a large literature on civil disobedience, basically showing that nonviolent civil disobedience is the best strategy for defending democracy as opposed to violent disobedience. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, it gives us hope since there's enough groups now teaching us about civil disobedience and nonviolence. So anybody that wants to do something, there's a whole list of them now. Oh, this was wonderful, sir. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Teresa to end the meeting.
Well, this was amazing. It was also a little frightening, because so much what you talked about this evening that has occurred in other countries has occurred here in this country in just 8.5 months. I see the free speech issues, of course, private gains from public office, a polarization, all of that in just 8.5 months. Things seem to be moving rather quickly. But I do want to ask you about something that happened 230 years ago yesterday, where our framers signed their names to a new government that was established by we the people. And it's been reported that the next day, a delegate by the name of McHenry had indicated in his diary that a woman asked Benjamin Franklin if or what did the convention establish? Did it establish a monarchy or did it establish a republic? And Franklin reportedly said, "Well, a republic, if you can keep it." So I'm going to ask you from your worldview and the course that you've designed on the possibility of autocracy in this country. What's your take on the significance of Franklin's quote in today's environment?
well, I think in a sort of more abstract version, that's kind of the model I was trying to show you with this kind of the way in which constitutions are not self-enforcing. And I think essentially what Benjamin Franklin is talking about at that particular point is the notion that we have this constitution, but it's not necessarily going to defend itself. And I think that's the point of the quote that I had there from the judge as well. The Constitution is a way to coordinate. You need a Constitution. The Constitution helps people who are trying to collectively act against an aggrandizement of power. It gives them basically the recipe, the toolbook to do it, but people have to do it. You need the people within those institutions to actually occasionally go against their material interests. And I think that's kind of what he was talking about. In terms of I think I have a reasonably optimistic view that it won't be as bad as many other cases, but I think I have a pessimistic view that it'll be as good as we've been used to having in our past. Although I will say that the United States democracy, I think, sometimes is seen as more long-lasting than it actually was. Really, we didn't have African Americans really couldn't vote until the 1960s. So by even our own measures, the United States is actually a fairly new democracy as well. An old republic, but a new democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your insights on the politics of democratic and authoritarian governments. And honestly, I don't think that we can effectively oppose or resist anything that's going on in our country unless we really understand not only what's happening, but why it's happening. And I think you've given us a lot of the answers to the why tonight, which I honestly think is missing in a lot of what we're seeing in the media. Right now, we see a lot what's going on, what is happening, but the why is so important. And I think you've done just an amazing job with helping us with the why tonight. So I'm sure I can speak for everybody that's here tonight when I say that we learned a great deal from you from this presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks so
Teresa,
much.
tell them that they'll be able to access it again on our YouTube channel on the League of Women Voters. So
Yes,
if
absolutely.
there's
If you
more that
missed
you
it, or
want
if
to
you know
say.
anybody that wants to see it because they weren't able to show up, absolutely. And again, thank you, Professor Schuler, and thank all of you for being with us this evening. And thank you for everything that you do for our democracy. Have a great evening. Good night.
Fun. Thanks so much. Good night,
Bye-bye,
everyone.
all.